Welcome to Truth Rooted. This is our first video series that we're putting out. This channel is been created in association with Rockland Community Church located in North Scituate, Rhode Island. I'm Pastor Tom Loghry, and we have created this channel in order to help you be rooted in biblical truth and also in the community of the church. The unique approach that we're trying to take with these videos is we want them to move from online conversations to in-person connections. So the first audience for these videos is the congregation of Rockland Community Church, and then our neighbors, those who live within the vicinity of our church. We want you to watch these videos and then join us for a supper discussion. Now, this series, God and Government, is going to have a supper discussion on November 1st at 6 p.m. So we want you to come out to that. Now, if you're watching from afar and you can't join us, I want to encourage you to connect with a local church so you can dig more deeply into God's truth. Now, the first series that we're doing here is God and Government, looking at the relationship between the two. Where does government get its authority from? From the Christian perspective, we believe that government authority ultimately comes from God. So we're going to be exploring that. And kind of the first step in doing that is we have to understand what is the basis of divine authority and what is the basis of human authority. Working from that first question of what is government for? Well, that ties in directly to this question of authority. Because if we ask about the purpose of authority, we have to understand where does its source come from. Without any sort of grounding for that authority in terms of human governments, then we're really just left with a situation in which might makes right, where the strongest will decide what government is for. And at that point, anything goes. The Christian perspective is that human government, the authority of human government, is rooted in a divine commission, and the authority possesses is a delegated authority from God himself. So before we get to this question of human authority, we have to ask, what is the basis of divine authority? Well, it is rooted in who God is. It's rooted in his nature. God has always existed. And as it says in John 1:3, anything else that exists because of God. It was made through him. God is the creator of everything, and he is the sustainer of everything. If God decided that something's not going to exist anymore, it would simply cease to exist. Which is a good reminder for us as human beings, because sometimes we can begin to think that we ought to exist or we necessarily exist. But human beings don't exist by necessity. God was not compelled to create us, and he's not compelled to sustain us. And so that puts us in a certain position before him of one of gratitude, where we deserve to give him thanks for our existence. And it's analogous to the relationship between parents and children. Parents are due certain honor and submission from their children more than any other adult or person, because without them, their children would not exist. And so those children ought to give them honor and submission. Now, we can ascribe God authority on the basis of his capabilities. Yes, he is all powerful. Yes, he is all knowing. But there is that moral aspect there in that we come from him. He is the one who created us, and so he is deserving. And because of who he is not a malevolent God. He is a perfectly good God. He is holy. He is just. He is merciful. And so as the creator, as a good creator, he's ordered everything unto a good end, unto an end that is good for us as his human creation. And so when we violate his order, his good designs, we will experience his justice as we violate his good design. Now, it's interesting because God does let us do exactly that. He does let us rebel. And that's because our free will is part of God's good design. But while we are able to rebel against God and go down our own path, it is important, once again, for us to remember that God is under no compulsion to sustain us. And in fact, it would be bad for God to allow us to live for all eternity without Him. It would just result in terrible, evil wickedness. And so when we decide that we're going to go on our own path, we're really quitting God. And if we quit God, what we're doing is quitting life itself, in fact, because He's the giver of life. As Paul says, quoting one of the Greek thinkers of the day in Acts 17:28, he says, "In Him we live and move and have our being, as even some of your own poets have said, for we are indeed His offspring." So living with God, rather than quitting God, living with God before God means living in alignment with His design for human flourishing. And that design includes human beings taking up the call to govern. Out of God's divine love and goodness, He ordered creation unto the end of human flourishing. Basically, He designed things to work well for us. And we see that in the natural creation where there's sun and rain, and we have the conditions for life, conditions that you don't find on other planets. But there's also a moral law, and again, that's the thing that we can buck against. That's the thing we can rebel against. But if we would live in accordance with God's moral law, then we would indeed prosper. Now, if there is no God, if there is no law, if there is no end, then there's no purpose, there's no design to anything. And in that case, as I said in the beginning, there is no real authority. There is no one way that things ought to be. And in that case, it's just might makes right. But God has, in fact, invested human life with purpose. He has created us in His image so that we are to reflect who He is. Now, we're not omniscient, we're not all-powerful, we're not all-knowing, but we can reflect His goodness, His mercy, His justice. And in alignment with those character qualities, He's given us a task to perform. And we find this in the creation mandate that's given at the moment of human beings' creation in Genesis 1:26 through 28. There it says, God said, "Let us make man in our image after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created man in His own image. In the image of God He created him. Male and female He created them, and God blessed them. And God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." We also see this report about God giving us dominion over creation in Psalms 8, verses 3 through 8. The psalmist writes, "When I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have set in place, what is man that you are mindful of him, and the son of man that you care for him? Yet you have made him a little lower than the heavenly beings and crowned him with glory and honor. You have given him dominion over the works of your hands. You have put all things under his feet, all sheep and oxen, and also the beasts of the field, the birds of the heavens, and the fish of the sea, whatever passes along the paths of the sea." Now, the thing that's really important for us to remember as we hear this language of dominion and subduing the creation is that God's not giving human beings the authority to abuse His creation. He's giving them the authority to tend to His creation in order that it might prosper. You think about a gardener tending to its garden, to the garden, pruning it so that it might bear more fruit. Now we see another indication of the authority given to human beings, in that we see this pattern of just as God brought creation into order through speaking it into existence, that Adam is given the opportunity to get in on the game in Genesis 2:19 by naming the animals. It says, "Now out of the ground the Lord God had formed every beast of the field and every bird of the heavens, and brought them to the man to see what he would call them, and whatever the man called every living creature, that was its name. And just along the same lines of divine speech and authority in speech, we see Satan disputing God's speech in Genesis 3 when he says, did God really say that you weren't to eat of any of the trees in the garden? So when we think about the authority that God has given human beings, it's important for us to understand that it's not an absolute authority. And I've made an illustration to kind of demonstrate this. God's authority is firm. It's a bounded circle. It's absolute and encompasses everything. Human beings have been given a delegated authority over creation, but it's not absolute. God can intervene at any moment along any lines, and human beings must ultimately answer to God. Now, I've given a kind of a gray line there around the black dotted line in order to demonstrate that human beings have in fact been given authority over other human beings. And we see some instances of this outside of the sphere of government. When we look at the Ten Commandments, we see the fifth commandment, Exodus 20:12, where it says, honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. God is recognizing the authority that parents have over children. And again, that's an authority that's supposed to be working to the good of one's children. But it's authority all the same, where honor is due. We see in Ephesians 5, verses 22 through 24, the authority of headship that husbands are supposed to have in the marriage relationship over their wives. Once again, not for their own selfish benefit, but for the benefit of their wives. It goes on to say that husbands are just supposed to lay down their lives for their wives as Christ laid down his life for the church. But it says there, wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord, for the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and is himself its Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, also wives should submit in everything to their husbands. So we see examples of delegated human authority outside of the sphere of government. But we do see it also in the sphere of government. We see it indicated in Matthew 22:21, when Jesus says, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, unto God what is God's. In Romans 13, the words that Paul has to say there about governmental authority. We're going to get more into those passages as we go along. But the point of all this is to say that any authority that human beings possess derives from God's divine purpose, which is human good, human flourishing, and God's authority. So human authority is not absolute. It always must answer to God. And if there is no God, then there is no purpose or real authority behind government beyond what human beings might fabricate by arming themselves to the teeth and saying, well, you better do what I say or else. That's a world that we don't want to live in, because a world without fear of God is a much more dangerous place.